My name is Clara Vance, and I am 35. 6 days after we buried my mother. My brother changed the locks on the house I grew up in and set my daughter us things on the porch in the pouring rain. Maya us winter boots were soaked through. Her stuffed bear was face down in a puddle of mud, and Julian stood in the doorway. Our father, us, doorway. The doorway of a house that has been in this family since 1912. And told me I was a nobody. The legacy keeps the Vance name, he said. Daughters are just visitors. You should have learned your place a long time ago. He said more after that. He said, I hope you enjoy being homeless. He said he had made sure I would get absolutely nothing. But here is what Julian did not count on. There was one final section to that will, and when the estate lawyer read it out loud, when he announced my exact net worth to a room full of people who had spent my entire life calling me the spare child, my brother hit the floor. Welcome back to the channel where quiet people finally get the last word and the paperwork does the shouting. If a family ever made you feel like the leftover child, the one they never bothered to count, this story is for you. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. And be sure to subscribe. Now, let me take you back to Oak Haven, Vermont. Population 9. Ling ling ling. Give or take. Where the Vance name still holds weight, or at least it used to. Oak Haven sits right where the valley dips into the evergreen forests. It is the kind of town where people know your grandfather-us name, your credit score, and exactly which pew you sit in on Sunday mornings. The Vances helped build half the historic district. My great-grandfather started the shop, Vance Horology and Restorations, in 1924, and the sign still hangs on Main Street in hand-painted gold leaf. My father, Arthur Vance, ran that clock shop for 35 years. He was a master with his hands, capable of restoring century-old grandfather clocks, and he was terrible with his daughters. I say daughters, but there was only one, me. And then there was Julian, 5 years older, the firstborn son, the one whose name fit the legacy. Growing up, the division of labor was painfully simple. Julian went to the clock shop after school. I went to the kitchen with my mother, Eleanor. Julian learned to calibrate pendulums and polish brass gears. I learned to bake casseroles and keep my mouth shut. My father had a phrase he repeated like a morning prayer. Every Thanksgiving, every property tax season, every time someone asked about the future of the business, he would say, the legacy keeps the Vance name. Daughters are just visitors. He said it the way you would say the sun rises in the east. Not meant to be cruel, just stating a fact. Eleanor would press her lips together and pass the potatoes. I would stare at my plate and count the peas. When I was 16, I asked my father if I could work in the shop on weekends. He looked at me like I had asked to burn the building down. What for? He said, you are not staying. I left Oak Haven 2 years later with a duffel bag and a small brass winding key my father had given me when I was 10. The kind of key used for antique pocket watches. He had pressed it into my palm one afternoon and said, there. Now you have a piece of the shop. It was the only time he ever gave me anything related to his work. I put myself through a degree in actuarial science at Boston University. Then, a Master-us degree in corporate risk management. It is the kind of work where you analyze liabilities, uncover hidden debts, and follow the money through shell companies until you find the executive who thought they were smarter than the audit. I was good at it. I was remarkably good. But 27. I was working at a major firm in Boston, pulling apart corporate bankruptcies that made the financial news. But 30. I had started my own firm, Vance Risk Analytics, 3 employees. Then 10. Then 30. I built it in a rented office above a coffee shop. And I built it completely alone. Julian called my work the calculator job. My father called it something to keep me busy until I found a husband. Eleanor, my mother, just asked if I was sleeping enough. Nobody in Oakhaven knew what an actuary actually did. And nobody cared to learn. At family dinners, when Julian talked about his plans to expand the shop or flip luxury real estate on the side, my father leaned in and nodded with pride. When I mentioned closing a massive liquidation case for a Fortune 500 client, he would say, "That is nice. Clara, pass the bread." So, I stopped mentioning it. I stopped bringing up my firm, my corporate clients, the massive financial growth. I kept the brass winding key in the inside pocket of my purse. A tiny piece of metal that smelled like brass polish, and my father-us hands. I carried it everywhere. Not because I missed him exactly, but because it reminded me of what a Vance was supposed to look like, and how quietly I had become the most successful one of them all. By the time I sold a majority stake in my firm last year, my net worth was sitting pretty at over $6 million. My family thought I rented a tiny apartment and drove a basic sedan because I could not afford anything better. I drove that car because it was reliable and I liked it. Nobody ever bothered to ask. My father died 15 months ago. It was a massive heart attack. He was standing at his workbench on a Wednesday morning, setting the gears for a vintage mantle clock, and his heart just stopped beating. The paramedics said he was gone before he hit the hardwood floor. I got the call at my desk in Boston. Sarah, my business partner, drove me all the way to Vermont because my hands would not stop shaking long enough to grip the steering wheel. When I arrived at the house, Julian was already holding court in the living room, accepting condolences and shaking hands with the local town councilman. He had put on a tailored suit. He looked exactly like a man who had been rehearsing for this exact moment his entire life. I handled everything else. I managed the funeral home arrangements, the death certificates, the life insurance calls, the church bulletin printing. Eleanor was too hollowed out by grief to function, and Julian was too busy being the grieving heir in public to do any of the actual heavy lifting in private. I did not complain. That is my fatal flaw, if you want to call it that. I see a gap and I fill it. I see a job nobody wants to do and I take it. My therapist calls it over-responsibility. The compulsion to carry the weight of the world because nobody ever taught you it was safe to put things down. A few days after the funeral, I noticed something strange. Eleanor had a private meeting with Harrison Sterling, my parents' estate attorney, at his office on Main Street. She went completely alone. She came back quieter than usual, but somehow steadier, like someone who had just made a massive decision. I asked her if everything was okay. She just patted my hand. "Your father-us affairs are very complicated," she said. "Sterling is sorting it out." I did not push her. I should have. But I had Maya to get back to, a firm to run, and a mother who seemed like she desperately wanted to carry this one single thing by herself. So I lit her. Eleanor had a massive stroke 2 months ago. She was sitting in her greenhouse pruning the orchids she had kept alive since I was a child. And something in her brain just gave way. The neighbor found her collapsed on the stone path. She died at the county hospital 4 hours later. I was in my car within 20 minutes of getting the call. Maya sat in the back seat, watching the trees blur past the window, not saying a single word because 8-year-olds can sense when a situation is too heavy for conversation. The funeral was at the community church where 4 generations of Vances had been baptized and buried. Over 100 people showed up. Julian gave the eulogy. He stood at the pulpit in a dark designer suit and spoke for 15 minutes. He talked about carrying the family legacy. He talked about the clock shop. He talked about what it meant to be the Vance son, standing exactly where his father and grandfather had stood before him. He mentioned our mother, us cooking. He mentioned her greenhouse. He did not mention that she had spent the last 15 months totally alone in that big house, managing a crushing grief she never should have had to manage by herself. He did not mention me at all. Afterward, at the reception, Aunt Beatrice, my mother, us older sister, pulled me aside and squeezed my shoulder. It was a beautiful service. She said, "Your father would have been so proud of Julian." I almost laughed out loud. I held it in. As I was helping Maya put on her winter coat, a man in a crisp gray suit appeared right beside me. Harrison Sterling, the estate lawyer, 68 years old, dry as dust, the kind of attorney who measures his words the way a jeweler measures diamonds. "Stay in town," he said quietly. "Your father made significant changes to the will after Julian.us business troubles. You will want to hear them. Both of you must be together." Then he nodded once and simply walked away. 6 days after we buried my mother, Julian called me. I was standing in the kitchen of my parents' house, making toast for Maya. The morning light came through the window over the sink, exactly the way it always had, bright and cold, catching the dust, floating above the counters. "I need you out of the house by Friday," Julian said. There was no greeting, no asking how I was doing, just a hard demand, like a landlord giving an eviction notice. "Excuse me," I said. "The house is mine, Clara." Dad made that perfectly clear for 30 years. The probate process is just a formality. Sterling will confirm it. "I need you," and the kid packed up and out so Chloe and I can start the remodeling process. The kid, he called my daughter the kid. "We have not had the official reading yet," I said. "There is nothing left to read. You know the family rule. The legacy keeps the Vance name. You packed up and left. I stayed here." End of discussion. I could hear his wife Chloe in the background. Her voice was a sharp, grating sound. "Tell her Friday morning at the absolute latest." "Honey." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. Maya was sitting at the table watching me. A piece of toast stopped halfway to her mouth. "I am not leaving until Sterling reads that will," I said. "Then you will leave with absolutely nothing." Julian said, "And I want you to hear this loud and clear." He said it like he had been practicing this exact speech in the mirror for a decade. "I hope you enjoy being homeless, Clara. I made sure you get nothing." He hung up the phone. I set my phone face down on the counter. I finished making breakfast. I sat down across from my daughter and I ate my food. Because that is what you do when someone tries to pull the floor out from under you. You plant your feet on the ground and you eat your breakfast. When I tried to use my key on the front door that evening, the lock had already been completely changed. The heavy iron key, the one my father gave me when I turned 18, saying it was for whenever I wanted to come home, turned in the metal cylinder and caught dead. Our boxes were sitting out on the porch by the time I walked around the side of the house. 4 cheap cardboard moving boxes from the local hardware store, Maya Us clothes, my suitcase, my Mother Us vintage recipe box, the one she had explicitly promised to me, all of it sitting in a puddle of freezing rainwater on the wooden deck where my mother used to sit and drink her tea. Chloe opened the front door. She was wearing a luxury cashmere sweater and holding a glass of expensive red wine like she was hosting a charity gala. "Oh," she said, looking down at me the way you would look at a stray dog on your lawn, "you are still lurking around here. Where are Maya Us books?" I asked. "Julian packed up everything that belonged to you or her. This is not really her home, Clara." she has visited maybe 5 times in her life. Chloe said it like geography was the only true measure of family. Like a child needed to clock hours to earn a place in her own grandmother's home. I felt something cold and hard lock into position inside my chest. It was not anger. It was pure, absolute clarity. I walked to my car, loaded the soggy boxes into the trunk, and buckled Maya safely into her seat. Then I walked right back up to the porch. Chloe was still standing there, sipping her wine, watching me like I was cheap entertainment. "You can keep the new locks," I said. "You can keep every single room in this house. But you will never speak about my daughter again. Not to me. Not to Julian. Not to anyone in this entire town. That is not a request." Chloe, us. Smug smile vanished. She took a step back inside and slammed the door shut. I got back into the car. Maya was holding her damp stuffed bear tightly against her chest. "Where are we going now?" "Mom," she asked quietly. I did not have a real answer yet. I just put the car in drive. We ended up at the Whispering Pines Motel out on the county highway. About 2 miles past the town limits. It cost $50 a night. It had 2 sagging beds, a noisy heater, and a window that looked out over the parking lot toward the tree line. Maya thought it was a grand adventure. She jumped on the bed and asked if we could order a large pizza. I told her yes, mostly because I could not speak a full sentence without my voice breaking. I sat on the edge of the second bed and stared blindly at my phone. I owned a gorgeous condo in Boston. I had a massive life there. A very good one. I could easily pack Maya into the car, drive 3 hours south, and never set foot in Vermont ever again. I could let Julian have the big house. I could let him have the shop, the gold leaf sign, and the entire decaying kingdom. I did not need his money or his approval. I had built my own empire, but Sterling had specifically told me to stay, and Eleanor, my quiet mother, had met with the lawyer all alone after the first funeral and walked out looking like a woman who had finally dropped a heavy burden she had carried for 40 years. I owed it to her memory to hear whatever this secret was. And if I am being totally honest with you, Oakhaven was the only place Maya had ever spent time with her grandparents. She loved the greenhouse in the backyard. She loved the sprawling 40 acres of untouched timber and apple orchards behind the property down by the valley ridge. Maya called it the magic forest. So I decided to stay. Not to fight Julian. Not to win a prize. I stayed because Sterling asked me to. Because my mother would have wanted me to be there. And because my daughter deserved to know this town the way I used to. Long before the Vance name became a club that only admitted men, Harrison Sterling's office was located on the 2nd floor of a brick building on Main Street. Just 2 doors down from the clock shop. The staircase smelled like old parchment and lemon wax. His heavy oak desk was built by my grandfather. The massive bookshelves behind him held 50 years of legal statutes and a framed photograph of him shaking hands with my father at a town hall meeting in the late 90s. "Have a seat, Clara," he said, pointing to the leather chair across from him. He never bothered with small talk. I always respected that about him. "The formal reading of the will is scheduled for next Thursday. Both you and Julian are legally required to be present." "Required?" I asked. "Your father-us will contains a very specific provision that can only be executed with both of his children sitting in the room. I am the executor of the estate. Those are the strict terms." I leaned forward. "Sterling, what exactly did my father change?" He folded his hands together on the desk, moving carefully the way smart people do when they are selecting their words. "After your brother, us real estate business ran into severe difficulties. After your father was forced to co-sign certain heavy obligations and restructure massive debts, Arthur revised a hidden section of his will. He added a strict condition to the transfer of one specific asset. Which asset? I asked. The back property. The 40 acres of timber and the apple orchard by the ridge. My chest felt tight. The magic forest. What kind of condition did he attach? The kind that legally requires both beneficiaries to submit a certified, verified financial statement before the land can be awarded to anyone. Your father wanted undeniable, documented proof that whoever takes possession of that pristine land can afford to hold it without leveraging it, without mortgaging it, and without losing it to hungry creditors. Sterling paused and looked right into my eyes. Your father learned a very hard lesson, Clara. It happened late in his life. But he finally learned it. What did he learn? I asked. Sterling picked up a heavy silver pen and tapped it gently on his desk. He learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one you should trust with the keys to the vault. He stood up. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. Bring your financial documentation. Bring everything. Julian and Chloe moved their things into the main house within 2 days. By the end of the weekend, they had already ripped out my mother-us vintage kitchen cabinets, the solid oak ones my grandfather built by hand, and replaced them with cheap, modern, flat-pack garbage they ordered online. Chloe posted pictures on her social media. The caption read, "Starting a fresh chapter, honoring the family legacy by making the space truly ours." It got 100 likes. I drove past the clock shop on Monday afternoon and saw a large paper sign taped to the front window. Estate sale. Tools, parts, and equipment. Everything must go today. My father, us life work, his precision lathes, his magnifying loupes, his delicate brass calipers, 4 decades of perfectly maintained instruments. Each piece had been oiled and hung in exact order on the wall. Julian was selling them off to strangers like cheap garage sale junk. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 20 minutes, leaving the engine running, just watching random people walk out the door, carrying my father-us legacy in plastic shopping bags. I almost drove back to the motel. I really almost did. Then I saw it, shoved carelessly against the back wall behind a pile of broken chair legs. My father, us old wooden apprentice box, the heavy mahogany one with the brass hinges. The estate inventory had specifically left it to me. The document read, "Personal hand tools and wooden apprentice box go to Clara." It was the only item in the entire estate that had my name attached to it. I walked through the front door. Julian was standing at the cash register, counting a thick stack of $20 bills. He looked up and scowled. "You are not welcome in here," he said. "That mahogany box belongs to me." I said, "Dad-us will listed it. You already know that." He stared at me for a long, "S'il maman." Then he let out a harsh laugh. "Take it. It is nothing but useless junk anyway." Exactly like everything else he left for you. The wooden box was much heavier than I expected. I had to carry it to my car using both arms. I placed it gently in the trunk right next to Maya, US spare boots. When I set it down, something shifted deep inside the box. A heavy metallic scrape, like a metal object sliding against the wooden floor of the chest. I did not open it right away. I really wish I had I want to pause the story right here because I know some of you watching have held a box exactly like this one. The one tiny, seemingly worthless thing a parent left behind while the golden child took the house, the money, and the business. If that is you, tell me down in the comments what was inside your box. Was it a watch? A book? An old recipe tin? I want to read your stories. And if this is resonating with you, hit the subscribe button so the algorithm pushes this video to people who need to hear it. All right, back to the heavy wooden box. And the family member who showed up at my cheap motel room 3 days later, Aunt Beatrice showed up at the Whispering Pines on a cold Wednesday evening, completely unannounced. She brought a large container of baked ziti and a very specific agenda. She was 65. My mother, us older sister, a retired bank teller who had lived in the next town over her entire life. She wore a thick wool cardigan and a facial expression that was trying incredibly hard to look sympathetic. "I heard about the locks on the house," she said, sitting down heavily on the edge of the mattress like she owned the motel. Maya was sitting at the tiny desk doing her math homework. Beatrice glanced at her for a second, then turned her attention entirely to me. "Clara, sweetheart, I know this feels incredibly unfair to you, but you need to understand something. This is how our family has always done things. Your father, us father, did the exact same thing to his sisters. My own father did the same thing to me. The boys keep the property. The girls move on and build lives somewhere else." There it was again. The family rulebook straight from the Gospel of Arthur Vance. "Beatrice, I am a single mother," I said. "I have an 8-year-old daughter sleeping in a highway motel room because my older brother threw our personal belongings into the freezing rain. And that is terrible behavior." She said quickly, "It truly is. But fighting him on this will only make it worse for everyone." She leaned closer to me. "I gave up my rightful share of your grandfather-us lake cabin. It was beautiful property. I signed the deed completely over to my brother because that is what was expected of me. And you know what happened? I survived. You will survive this, too." She said the word survive like it was the ultimate goal. Like a woman, us highest possible ambition in life should be to endure robbery with a polite smile. "Did you actually want that lake cabin, Beatrice?" I asked her. She stopped talking. She blinked twice. For a fraction of a second, something totally honest and raw moved across her aging face, a quick flash of ancient anger. A deep loss. The kind of pain that turns into stone over the years, because the alternative is simply too heavy to carry around. "It does not matter what I wanted back then," she finally said. "It matters what keeps the peace today." She left the pasta. She left her unsolicited advice, and she left me sitting alone in that dingy motel room, finally understanding for the first time that Aunt Beatrice was not just protecting the family tradition, she was its oldest living victim. The next morning, I set up my work laptop on the wobbly motel desk, brewed a cup of terrible instant coffee, and went right back to being Clara Vance. Lead actuary, risk management expert, and founder of a firm that billed nearly $20 million in corporate fees last year. Maya sat on the bed watching cartoons on low volume while I reviewed a massive bankruptcy file for a tech company in Seattle. Numbers have always calmed my nerves. They always do. Numbers do not play favorites. Numbers do not care if you are the firstborn son or the forgotten daughter. They just tell you the absolute truth. Around noon, I called Sarah, my business partner back in Boston. Technically, she was the managing partner now since I sold my majority shares. But I still maintained a massive equity position and an advisory role. "How is the charming rustic life treating you?" she asked over the phone. "My brother sold off my father-us vintage tools for pocket change. And my aunt brought me cold pasta and a lecture about knowing my place in the hierarchy." I said, "Do they still think you are a low-level data entry clerk?" Sarah laughed. "They think I am a clerk who cannot afford to buy her own groceries." I replied. Sarah was quiet for a second. "Clara, do these people have any idea what your net worth actually is?" I looked out the motel window at the cracked asphalt parking lot. My sensible sedan was parked between a rusty pickup truck and a commercial van. Nobody in Oak Haven had ever seen the inside of my investment portfolio. Nobody had ever bothered to ask me a single question about my life. They never asked. I said simply, "And you never volunteered the information." She pressed, "Why?" I had to think about that for a moment. The honest answer was deeply complicated. It was a mix of pride, stubbornness, and the lingering pain of being told my brilliant career was just a cute hobby. But the truest answer was this: because I should never have to prove my fundamental value to people who decided I was worthless before I was even old enough to speak. Sarah let out a heavy sigh. "That is fair. But Clara, if there is a legal reading coming up, and if significant assets are on the table, you might be forced to show them the real numbers whether you want to or not." 2 days before the meeting at the lawyer's office, I drove past the house on Maple Street just to check on my mother's greenhouse. It was an old habit. The orchids were already drooping. Nobody was maintaining the humidity. But the dying flowers are not what made me hit the brakes. There was a man standing on the front porch. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a crisp dress shirt with a regional bank logo embroidered on the pocket. He was talking to Julian through the screen door. And Juliana's voice was pitching upward in a way I had never heard before. It sounded tight, incredibly defensive, and bordering on desperate. "The estate funds will cover the balance," Julian was saying loudly. "Once the probate clears the courts, I will have access to the full accounts. You will get the payment. Mr. Vance," the banker said calmly. "This notice is the 4th one we have delivered. The balloon payment on the second mortgage is severely past due by www.a. I said the estate will handle it." Julian snapped. Julian suddenly noticed my car idling at the curb. His facial expression morphed from sheer panic to explosive anger in a matter of seconds. He shoved the screen door open and stepped out aggressively. The banker immediately retreated to his parked car without finishing his sentence. I did not wave. I did not roll down my window. I just sat there and processed what I had just heard. A second mortgage. On the very house Julian was parading around as his grand inheritance. On the house he had practically violently thrown me out of. A memory of my father surfaced in my mind. One of his few pieces of actual wisdom. He used to say, "A man who borrows money against his own foundation is a man building a house on a trap door." I always assumed my father was talking about keeping the clock shop out of debt. But sitting in my car, watching that banker speed away down the street, I began to realize that my father might have been talking about Julian all along. I drove back to the Whispering Pines. I did not open the heavy wooden box that night. My intuition told me I needed to wait until I was mentally prepared for whatever secret was locked inside. But my timeline was running short. The night before the will reading, I finally unlatched the box. Maya was fast asleep in the other bed. The motel room was dead silent except for the rattling air conditioner. I hauled the mahogany box onto my bed and flipped the heavy brass latches. Inside, I found a velvet polishing cloth, a set of precision screwdrivers, a tiny glass oil dropper, and buried at the very bottom, hidden under a false wooden panel, were 3 items that changed the entire story. The first item was a small brass winding key, not a generic one, but one that matched the key he gave me when I was 10. Wrapped around the top of the key was a piece of masking tape. Written on the tape in my father's messy handwriting was a simple message. C.V. to the Ridge. Clara Vance to the Ridge. The second item was an official bank document. Heavily folded, I opened it up, my hands feeling strangely steady for a woman holding dynamite. It was a formal lien notice from the First Regional Bank of Vermont. It was a massive second mortgage placed on the main house, dated 4 years ago. For the staggering amount of $420,000, my father's signature was scrawled at the bottom line. In the top margin, He had written a quick note in black ink. Ask Sterling about the orchard. I read the number again. 420,000. Then I picked up my cell phone and dialed Harrison Sterling's private number. It was 11 at night. He answered on the first ring, sounding completely awake. Like he had been sitting by the phone waiting for me to figure it out. You found the paperwork in the box, Sterling said. It was not a question. $420,000. I whispered into the phone. Against the main house. Your father took out a desperate second mortgage 4 years ago to cover your brother's catastrophic business failures. Julian's luxury condo project went completely bankrupt. He borrowed heavily from aggressive private lenders and was facing total ruin. Your father co-signed the bailout loans and then mortgaged the family home to the hilt just to keep Julian out of court. I sat back on the cheap motel bed, pressing the phone hard against my ear. So, the grand family house that Julian just kicked me out of, it is heavily encumbered. The equity is practically zero. Worse than zero. Sterling said flatly. The clock shop building carries its own separate lien. Julian never paid the brass suppliers. That is another $60,000 in debt. Combined. The legacy properties your brother is bragging about inheriting carry nearly $500,000 in secured toxic debt. The total asset value barely covers the loans. He is inheriting a sinking ship. If the real estate market dips even a fraction, he is completely underwater. I looked down at the brass winding key, thinking about the message. And what about the 40 acres by the ridge? The apple orchard. The 40 acres are the only completely unencumbered asset left in the entire Vance estate. There are 0 liens, 0 mortgages, and 0 debts attached to that land. The current market appraisal puts it at roughly $1.4 million. Your father knew with absolute certainty that if he left that prime land outright to Julian, your brother would mortgage it within a month to pay off his hidden debts. So, your father added the ironclad condition. Both children must submit verified financial statements. The pristine land passes legally to whichever child can prove they have the capital to hold it debt-free. He ruled from the grave. I said, recognizing the legal tactic, yes, he did. Sterling replied, and Vermont probate courts uphold conditional bequests like this every single day. Sterling took a deep breath. Your father realized the truth. Clara, it took him a lifetime, and it cost him his peace of mind. But he finally saw exactly who his son was. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for an hour. Holding the small brass key, Sterling officially contacted both of us the next morning to explain the financial statement requirement. Julian, us reaction was explosive. I could hear him yelling through the phone line even though Sterling had us on conference call. A financial audit. Fine. I will gladly do it. I have absolutely nothing to hide. He had $500,000 of toxic debt to hide. But Julian had spent 40 years believing that arrogant confidence was a valid substitute for actual competence. He genuinely believed he could bluff his way through a legal audit. He submitted his paperwork to Sterling by noon. Then, he called my cell phone. Just a heads up, Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. I already submitted my financials. That land is legally mine by tomorrow afternoon. I stayed in this town. Clara. I ran the family business. I kept the Vance name alive. A stupid piece of paper is not going to change 30 years of Dad telling the whole world who his successor was. All right, I said calmly. Bring your little office pay stubs. Clara, bring your basic tax returns. It does not matter what you show them. Dad's little test is just a formality to make sure the estate is secure. He knew I was the only one who qualified. He just wanted to make it official. All right, I said again. Is that all you know how to say? He snapped. What exactly do you want me to say? Julienne, silence on the line. Then, I want you to admit that the property, the money, the legacy, all of it was always meant to be mine. That is how this family operates. That is how the world works. I looked over at Maya, who was sitting on the floor drawing a picture of an apple tree with a green marker. I know exactly how the world works. I told him, I will see you tomorrow morning. I ended the call and dialed Sarah in Boston. I need a fully verified financial statement by 5 o'clock today. I told her, I need the full portfolio. Certified by our independent accounting firm. I want the total net worth summary printed in bold on the very first page. You are actually going to drop the bomb? Sarah asked, sounding thrilled. I am doing the final thing my father asked of me. I need it in 3 hours. Consider it done. That evening, after Maya fell asleep, I sat out on the motel balcony. The air was freezing, but I needed to clear my head. I did not need those 40 acres. I had millions of dollars. I had a thriving consulting firm. I had a beautiful daughter who would have a wonderful life, whether we lived in Massachusetts or on Mars. The cold, calculating actuary part of my brain, the part that analyzed risk for a living, I told me to just walk away. Let Julian inherit the orchard. Let him leverage it, bleed it dry, and watch the bank auction it off. None of his failure was my responsibility, but the other part of my brain, the part that remembered walking through the tall apple trees with my father, the way the valley looked when the leaves changed colors, the weight of that tiny brass key in my pocket, that part refused to let it go. My father had left me the hidden documents. He had directed me to ask the lawyer. He had intentionally engineered a scenario where the truth would be forced into the light. These were not the actions of a man who still believed the son was the rightful heir. These were the actions of a man desperately trying to correct a lifetime of catastrophic mistakes. I texted Sarah, send the certified statement directly to Sterling. She texted back instantly, sent and confirmed. Net worth certified at $6.2 million. You are locked and loaded. Boss. I looked out at the dark trees. I was not doing this just to destroy Julian's ego. I was doing it to finally balance the ledger, the morning of the will reading. Chloe showed up at the Whispering Pines at 8 in the morning. She was dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon. Designer slacks, a silk blouse, and a leather handbag that cost more than a used car. She was holding a thick manila envelope. Can we chat for a minute? She asked, flashing a tight, artificial smile, just woman to woman. I opened the door and let her step inside. Maya was in the bathroom brushing her hair. Chloe perched uncomfortably on the edge of the cheap mattress and slid the envelope onto the table. This is a formal quitclaim deed, she said smoothly. Julian asked me to run it over to you. If you sign this document today, you legally release any and all claims to the estate. The house, the shop, the land, everything. In return, Julian is willing to write you a check for $20,000 out of his own pocket, and he will let you keep all of Eleonora's photo albums. I stared at the paperwork. 4 pages of dense legal text, already stamped by a notary on Julian's end. He had paid a lawyer to draft this in a panic. $20,000. I repeated slowly. And some old photos. It is a very generous offer. Clara, considering the will heavily favors Julian anyway, you would end up spending way more than $20,000 on lawyer fees if you try to drag this through court. If you sign this, we all walk away clean. No family drama. No hard feelings. No hard feelings. I echoed. Your husband threw my 8-year-old daughter's belongings into the freezing mud. Chloe, fake smile, twitched. but she kept her voice perfectly level. Julian is under a tremendous amount of stress right now. He can be a little impulsive, but his heart is in the right place. I seriously doubt that. I picked up the quitclaim deed, folded it in half, and shoved it back into her envelope. I do not sign legal documents that I have not had my own team review, I said coldly, and I certainly do not sign away million-dollar properties in a motel room. If Julian has a legitimate settlement offer, he can present it formally through Sterling. Chloe stood up. The country club charm evaporated instantly. You are making this so much harder than it has to be. Clara, maybe, I said, or maybe I am just finally making it accurate. She stormed out of the room. I dropped the envelope straight into the trash can. At 9:30, Sarah called me. The documents are sitting on Sterling Us' desk. Certified, sealed, and audited. The managing partner signed it himself. She paused. Clara, you know exactly what is going to happen when they open that file in a room full of people who think you are a broke clerk. Right. I knew. I had run the behavioral models in my head 100 times. The risk analyst in me had mapped out every possible reaction. Julian, us absolute denial. Cluis, shock. Aunt Beatrice, us sheer confusion. The numbers printed on that certified statement told a story of brutal competence that none of them had ever bothered to read. Net worth, $6.2 million. $3 million from the firm buyout. $2 million in diversified stock portfolios. $800,000 in commercial real estate holdings in Boston. $400,000 in liquid cash and retirement accounts. I built every single penny of it with my own 2 hands. No family trust fund. No husband us money. No inheritance. Just 15 years of being violently brilliant at a job my family called a distraction. I am ready, I told Sarah. Good. Make the lawyer say the number out loud. Do not let them skim it. I grabbed my coat. It was time to go. Let us go to the reading. Sterling Us conference room smelled like old coffee and lemon wax. A massive mahogany table sat in the center of the room. 6 heavy leather chairs were positioned around it. A glass pitcher of water sat in the middle, and 2 pristine manila folders were placed perfectly at the head of the table where Sterling would sit. Julian arrived first. He was wearing a custom charcoal suit, a silk pocket square, and a luxury watch that caught the fluorescent lights. He pulled out his chair and sat down like a CEO preparing to fire his board of directors. Chloe walked in right behind him, her cell phone already out. Aggressively texting someone, Aunt Beatrice arrived next. Clutching her worn leather purse with both hands, she gave me a nervous nod and chose a seat as far away from Julian as physically possible. I took the chair directly across from my brother. I had left Maya with a trusted babysitter back at the motel. I decided she did not need to witness the carnage that was about to unfold. Inside my coat pocket, my fingers traced the edges of the brass winding key. Sterling walked into the room, shut the heavy wooden door, and took his seat at the head of the table. He placed his hands flat on top of the 2 folders. We will begin with the primary text of your father us will, Sterling said in a voice void of all emotion. Once that is established, we will address the conditional addendum. Julian smirked. He actually smirked. Sterling opened the first folder, the last will and testament of Arthur Thomas Vance, revised 2 years ago, witnessed and notarized in Oakhaven, Vermont. He read through the boring legal boilerplate: funeral expenses, executor powers, standard debt clearances. He read in a flat, rhythmic tone. Then he reached the distribution of assets. To my son, Julian Arthur Vance, I leave the following: the primary residential property located on Maple Street, including all outbuildings, the commercial property located on Main Street, operating as Vance Horology, including all current inventory and fixtures, and all adjoining real property comprising the main homestead. Julian leaned back in his chair. He nodded slowly, soaking in the words like rain in a desert. To my daughter, Clara Vance. I leave my wooden apprentice box and the personal tools contained within. That was it. One single sentence. 35 years of being a daughter. Reduced to a box of screwdrivers, Aunt Beatrice let out a long, sad sigh. Chloe was already tapping her manicured nails on the table in victory. Julian leaned forward and looked right at me. The legacy keeps the Vance name, he whispered across the table. The phrase hung in the air like toxic gas. I am sorry it played out this way, Clara. But Dad made his choice. He always knew who was capable. I said nothing. I kept my eyes fixed on Sterling. Sterling looked at Julian with an expression that bordered on absolute pity. Mr. Vance, Sterling said loudly, we are not finished. Julian waved his hand dismissively. What is left to read? She gets a box of rusty tools. I get the real estate. Wrap it up. It is not wrapped up. Sterling closed the first folder and placed his hand heavily on the second one. Your father us will contains a conditional addendum. I am legally bound by the terms of the estate to read this section aloud to both beneficiaries before a single title can be transferred. Julian us. Smugness hardened into irritation. He stood up from his chair, trying to command the room. A conditional addendum. Fine. Read the damn paper. But let us be brutally honest about what is happening here. He pointed a finger at me. My sister abandoned this family when she was 18. She ran off to the city. She got a job typing numbers into a computer. She did not maintain the shop. She did not take care of the properties. I did all of that. Every single holiday. Every broken pipe. Every time Dad needed a cosigner for a loan. Julian stopped speaking. He realized his mistake a second too late. He cleared his throat. I stayed. She left. That is the final math. He looked at me with pure venom. Enjoy the motel. Clara. Sterling waited in silence. He waited exactly the way a judge waits for a criminal to finish digging his own grave. When Julian finally sat back down, Sterling opened the second folder. The final section of Arthur Vance U.S. will, Sterling said, concerns the disposition of a secondary parcel of land not included in the main homestead grant. Specifically, the 40 acres of timber and the apple orchard located on the Valley Ridge, currently appraised at $1.4 million. Julian blinked. Chloe stopped tapping her nails. Aunt Beatrice looked up. This specific parcel, Sterling continued, is strictly subject to a conditional bequest. Your father attached a financial requirement that I am now ordered to execute. Sterling pulled a thick piece of parchment paper from the file. I recognize the heavy legal stock. I will read your father us exact words. Sterling said, adjusting his reading glasses. I, Arthur Thomas Vance, being of sound mind, do hereby order that the 40-acre ridge parcel shall not be distributed as part of the standard homestead. This land has remained untouched by debt for 4 generations. I have watched other properties in this family be leveraged, heavily mortgaged, and nearly destroyed by reckless financial decisions. I absolutely refuse to let this land suffer the same fate. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face was starting to turn red. Therefore, I legally direct my executor to demand that both of my children submit a comprehensive, verified financial statement, prepared and certified by an independent accounting firm, proving their current net worth and outlining all debt liabilities. The 40-acre parcel shall legally transfer to whichever child can mathematically demonstrate the financial capacity to own this land free and clear. without mortgaging it, without borrowing against it, and without placing any financial encumbrance upon it for a mandatory period of 15 years, Sterling took a breath. The room was so quiet you could hear the traffic outside on the street. If neither child meets this strict financial standard, the land shall be immediately auctioned, and the proceeds donated entirely to the Vermont Land Trust. I have spent my entire life loudly believing that the legacy belongs to the son. I was entirely wrong. A legacy does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to whoever is strong enough to carry it. That final line hit me like a physical blow. My father. The man who told me I was just a visitor in his house. The man who ignored my entire career. Had sat in a lawyer's office and written those devastating words. Knowing they would outlive him, Julian opened his mouth to speak. But nothing came out. Sterling set the parchment down. Both of your verified financial statements were submitted to my office this morning. I will now review the numbers for the official record. Sterling opened 2 sealed envelopes. He placed the documents side by side. He picked up Julian's statement first. Julian Arthur Vance. Verified financial statement, prepared by regional accountants in Burlington. Total reported assets. Residential property on Maple Street. Estimated value $400,000. Commercial property on Main Street. Estimated value $90,000. Vehicles and personal checking $12,000. Sterling did not look up. Total liabilities. Second mortgage on the Maple Street property. Balance $420,000. Supplier liens on the commercial property. Balance $60,000. Outstanding high-interest personal loans. Balance $95,000. Credit card debt $40,000. The numbers floated in the air like a death sentence. Calculated net worth. Sterling said, his voice ringing like a bell. $113,000. Julian's jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth would crack. Chloe grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. That is a temporary cash flow issue. Julian stammered loudly. The business is in a transition phase. Those debts are actively being restructured. Once the estate settles, I will liquidate some assets. And Mr. Vance. Sterling interrupted, his voice turning to ice. The legal condition requires demonstrated financial capacity today, not projected future earnings, not optimistic restructuring plans. Your certified statement proves absolute insolvency. The house you are inheriting is worth $400,000. It carries $420,000 in toxic debt that you personally generated, and your father absorbed to save you from prison. You did not inherit an empire. Julian, you inherited a massive bill. Julian turned his head and stared at me. It was the first time in my entire adult life that my brother actually looked at me. Not past me. Not down at me. He looked directly into my eyes. And what I saw staring back at me was naked. Pathetic terror. The sheer panic of a man realizing his entire identity was built on stolen money. And the bank had just called to collect. Read hers. Julian choked out, his voice cracking. Read my sister's statement. Sterling picked up the second document. Clara Vance. Verified financial statement prepared and audited by elite independent CPAs in Boston. He turned to the second page. The silence in the room was suffocating. Total assets. Equity ownership in Vance Risk Analytics post-buyout. $3 million. Diversified market portfolios. $2 million. Commercial real estate holdings in the Boston metropolitan area. $800,000. Liquid cash and retirement accounts. $400,000. Chloe made a terrible noise in the back of her throat. like she was choking on a piece of ice. Total liabilities. Sterling continued seamlessly. Zero. No outstanding debts. No mortgages. No liens. No encumbrances of any kind whatsoever. He placed the paper gently onto the mahogany table. Certified net worth, $6.2 million. The number dropped into the center of the table and exploded. 6.2 million. Every single dollar earned by my own mind. Every single dollar belonging solely to me. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on a dock, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly, pale gray. Aunt Beatrice pressed both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Chloe dropped her expensive cell phone on the floor. It shattered the screen. But she did not even reach down to pick it up. I did not say a single word. I did not have to. I reached into my coat pocket, wrapped my fingers around the brass winding key, and waited. By the strict legal terms of your father us conditional addendum, Sterling announced, Clara Vance is the sole qualifying beneficiary. The 40-acre ridge parcel and the apple orchard legally pass entirely to Clara. Sterling looked over at Julian. Mr. Vance, do you have any legal questions regarding this decision? Julian's hands were flat on the table, trembling violently. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. 6. He whispered to the empty room. 6 millions. 6.2. Sterling corrected him effortlessly. Because Harrison Sterling was a man who respected absolute precision. And then, my older brother's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed. He went down hard. His shoulder hit the heavy leather chair on the way down, and the chair slammed into the table. The impact knocked over the glass water pitcher. It shattered across the mahogany wood, sending a wave of ice water flooding over. Julian U.S. useless financial statements. Chloe screamed. It was a sharp, terrified sound, and she lunged onto the floor next to him. Aunt Beatrice jumped up so fast her purse spilled out onto the carpet. Sterling us paralegal was already dialing for an ambulance. He is breathing, the paralegal said calmly, pressing 2 fingers to Julian Doss' neck. His pulse is racing. Looks like a vasovagal syncope. He just fainted from the shock. I stayed in my chair. I did not jump up to help. I did not gloat. I did not laugh. I did not feel any grand sense of triumph or cinematic joy watching the man who threw my daughter's toys in the mud pass out on a lawyer's carpet because a piece of paper told him the reality of his sister's power. I just felt incredibly tired. I felt the deep, bone-aching exhaustion of a woman who had spent 35 years being underestimated and had finally watched the bill come due. Chloe was frantically fanning Julian's face with a legal folder. Aunt Beatrice was backed against the wall, crying softly. Sterling sat perfectly still at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly, waiting with the infinite patience of a man who had seen arrogant men faint before and would inevitably see them faint again. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass winding key. I placed it gently on the table, right next to the puddle of spilled water. The key to the legacy, the key my father handed me when I was 10. The paramedics arrived in under 10 minutes. By the time they walked in, Julian was sitting upright in a chair, a cold, wet towel pressed to the back of his neck. The EMTs checked his vitals and told him to follow up with a cardiologist. He refused to go to the hospital. Of course he refused. Men like Julian do not admit weakness in public. When the paramedics finally left the room, Julian looked across the ruined table at me. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone. His face looked like a building that had just been hit by a wrecking ball. You knew. He rasped, his voice full of venom. You sat there this whole time and you knew about the money. I knew I had built a multi-million-dollar company. I replied coldly. I knew I earned my wealth. I did not know it would matter in this specific room until 3 days ago. You hid it from us. You let us think you were broke. You set this up to make me look like an absolute fool. You looked exactly how you chose to look. Julien, I did not make a single financial decision for you. His bottom lip actually trembled. And then came the desperate self-pity. It always arrives right on schedule. I stayed here. Clara. I stayed in this boring town, and I ran the shop, and I did everything Dad ever asked me to do. I gave my whole life to this family legacy, and now I am drowning in debt. And you are sitting on $6 million. And the land? The land is going to someone who does not even care about the name. That was not me. The voice came from the corner of the room. Everyone turned to look. It was Aunt Beatrice. She was standing up straight. Her arms crossed tight against her chest. Tears streaming down her wrinkled face. That was me. Beatrice said loudly, I gave up 50 acres of lakefront property. I handed it over to my brother because I was told that was the rule. The boys keep the property. And it ruined my life. Julien, that stupid rule ruined my entire financial future. She wiped her face aggressively with her sleeve. Your father was wrong. My father was wrong. And I was completely wrong for going to that motel and telling Clara to just accept it. Beatrice looked directly at me. I am so sorry. Clara. I nodded at her. I believed she meant it. But apologizing for the past and fixing the future are two very different things. And Beatrice knew that just as well as I did. 3 months later, the main house on Maple Street went into foreclosure. Julien could not make the balloon payments on the second mortgage. The exact mortgage my father took out to save him. The regional bank filed the official eviction notice in early November. Chloe packed her bags and moved out 10 days before the sheriff auction. She took the cheap modern cabinets she had installed. But she left the antique grandfather clock in the hallway because it was too heavy for the movers to lift. Julien tried to contest the conditional addendum in court. His desperate lawyer filed a motion to void the will. Sterling responded by submitting the certified will, the financial statements, and a brutal 12-page legal brief citing Vermont case law on conditional estates. The judge dismissed Julien's motion in less than 2 weeks. The ruling was exactly 3 sentences long. The judge declared the condition lawful, clear, and perfectly enforceable. Julien never called me again after that day in court. Aunt Beatrice sent me a nice floral card for Thanksgiving. It had no long message. Just her signature at the bottom. I did not write back. But I put it on my fridge. Some generational wounds just take a long time to heal. In late November, I drove Maya down to the 40-acre ridge for the very first time since the reading. The trees were bare. The air was crisp and freezing. And the old apple orchard smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Maya put on her winter boots and ran ahead of me. Picking up fallen pine cones and exploring the edges of the property, I walked slowly behind her. Feeling the cold wind on my face, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass winding key. I held it in my palm. Feeling the cold metal against my skin, CV to the ridge. Clara Vance to the ridge. Julien had told me he hoped I enjoyed being homeless. I looked out over 40 acres of totally unencumbered, pristine timberland, paid for in full, completely untouched by the arrogant failures of the men who came before me. I watched my daughter run through the trees, totally free, totally secure in her future. I thought to myself, I am finally home. Your worth is not determined by whoever yells the loudest. It is not determined by whoever stayed in the hometown, or whoever was born with the correct name or the right gender. Your absolute worth is measured entirely by what you are capable of carrying on your own 2 shoulders. My father learned that reality way too late to ever say it to my face. but he learned it just in time to write it down on paper and make it legally binding. That is my true story. A wooden apprentice box. 40 acres of prime land. And an arrogant brother who discovered way too late what the word nothing actually looks like. If a toxic family member ever looked you in the eye and told you that you would amount to absolutely nothing, if they told you the legacy was not yours to hold, my advice is simple. Go out into the world and build an empire that only you are strong enough to carry. Then come back and tell me all about it. Drop your story in the comments. Hit the subscribe button. And I will see you in the next video.